just defining it. Okay, so it goes three together. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam vritti sarupyam itarata. So they go together. The first one is 4 words, all very important words. Okay, yoga, we know, some familiar with, it means to yoke or to join. And so saying that yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. Chitta means consciousness. That is the root. Chit means consciousness. And so in yoga, the mind or consciousness is seen as a field. So it takes place in a field, and that field is called chitta. And then vritti. Vritti is what happens in that field. So it's called turnings. Vritti, like parivritta trikonasana, the revolving triangle. So to turn is a vritti. Okay, and so that within the field of the mind, then thoughts, forms arise and pass away continually. Okay? And those are called vrittis. And they'll tell you that there's 5 kinds in the sutras. And so they're made up of various things, of like perception, a correct perception, like just basic stuff, like seeing that those curtains are kind of a teal color, or a wrong perception, like when it's dusk and you're walking along and there's a snake, but then you look closer and no, it's just a garden hose. So you're wrong. You thought for sure that was a snake, but no, it wasn't. So that's a vritti type. And then fantasy, like things that have no real corresponding physical reality, like a unicorn or the number 0. All these things, or nadis, shushumna nadi, imaginary things that you conjure with your mind. And those are all vrittis, memory. So things from the past that you're calling to mind. All these things, these thoughts arising in the field of the mind and passing away. Okay? And then then the last word, the real key word, nirodha, means tuk, to stop, means to cease. So that in the vritti field, when that comes to a standstill, when there's no longer the thought forms arising and passing, coming and going, then that's yoga. Okay? So the chitta field is but then that's not all. Okay? So that when that happens, then something else happens. When the mind stops, then tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. So that tada is then, and then drashtu is a very important word in the sutras. It means the seer. Okay, so that's a word named for, it's called purusha. So in this Yoga Sutras, it's based on the Indian philosophy system that's called Samkhya. It means to enumerate or to categorize. And so according to this philosophy, there's 25 main categories of reality. Okay? But there's really only 2 main categories. That the other 23 fall under one of those. Okay? So you've got 2 categories. One is called Purusha. That's this, drashtu, the seer. And then that second category is called Prakriti. It means the seeable. So there's a seer, and then there's everything that is seen by the seer. That's called nature or matter. Okay? And so when the mind field stops, then that seer it arrives in its swarupa. It's a very important word. Swarupa, it's 2 roots. It means that the intrinsic nature. So the essence of that thing is called it swarupa. Okay, it's the heart of it, the thing that makes it uniquely its own thing is the swarupa. Okay, and so the seer then comes to that place of its own very deepest nature arrives. Wow. And it stays there. But then, at other times, so then it goes on to the next sutra, vritti sarupyam itaratra. So at other times, then there's identification with the thought forms. So at other times means when there's no nirodha. When mind activity is happening, then there's identification with those. So it's this illusion. Okay, the thought forms that are arising and passing present an illusion, illusory reality. So things look like one thing, they feel like one thing, they sound like one thing. All the way the senses take it in, it's a sham. It's a magic show. That's called Maya. So it's not real because it's all in motion, proposing to be not in motion. It all looks stationary. Right? So we think those walls are solid. This floor, it's solid. But no, it's constantly moving. It's in constant change. Everything around, everything, the whole prakriti, that whole category of reality, of the seeable material, constantly changing, constantly changing. And yet, with the senses, you perceive no change. And even intellectually, when you know this building will not be here 500 years from now. It'll, maybe. You think it's built that well? Certainly 2,000 years from now. It won't be here. Okay? But we can't think that way. So we're constantly fooled by the senses into thinking that this right here is permanent and is what is all there is. But yoga teaches you, no, this is not. This is all in motion. And that this seer that's behind it all is actually eternal. No changing. No birth, death. No birth, life, death, birth, life, death, birth, life, death. So everything the senses can see is going through a cycle, cyclical activity. Right? But you can't perceive the cyclical activity unless you become very discerning, unless you stop the mind activity. So you have to, yoga techniques help you stop that vritti movement. And then you can see what's what. So when you are identifying with the changeable material and thinking that that is you and what is reality, then your action is based on ignorance. Okay, so they call that klesha, affliction. Okay, so that there's 5 of those kleshas, 5 afflictions. Okay, and the root affliction is called avidya. That means the opposite of knowledge. And it's not just any knowledge like, I know math, I know algebra. It's knowledge of the difference between Purusha and Prakriti, between those 2 categories of nature. Categories of reality. Okay, so look, in yoga, what they say is you come in the state of sun yoga. Sun yoga. That means mixing, confusing Purusha and Prakriti. It means that those 2 categories, the very 2 root categories, are confused. You're not clear about them. They're blended. So you're not sure what is self and what's the seer, what's the seeable, what's the material, what's the self. Confusion. Okay, that confusion is called avidya, ignorance. And so to end the sun yoga, that's called hana. To end is this. And make a separation. That is vidya, knowledge. Okay? So avidya is the root of the root causes of pain. Okay, and there's 5 of them. So one is that ignorance of this distinction between spirit and nature. between the seer and the seeable. Okay, then they go down a list. The second one is the ego. The I sense is misunderstood. Okay, so that the feeling of I-ness is coming from an attachment to the material. Okay, so I think this body, which is clearly not eternal, this body will be gone. Okay, so vairagya is to actually, there's a certain release or a surrender, a letting go aspect. And that opens you up to an appreciation of color, of melody, of rhythm. It's a very interesting contemplation. And so in that sense, it's a very different quality than the will. Okay, so there's a receptivity that has to accompany willpower. Okay, so if you only try to control, you're in for misery and suffering. Okay, there's a whole side of trust and of patiently waiting, receiving, dropping, so that it's a non-effort. Okay, so even like with the senses, the practice vairagya, the senses, instead of being very intense, so that eyeball is not really that there's a huge process of seeing. So that optic nerve goes all the way back to the back of the brain. Okay, so when impression of light comes in, it has to go way back to the back of the brain and then come forward again. Okay, so your whole feeling of seeing is back. It's very receptive. And hearing. Okay, so it's a whole different demeanor. That you're playing with when you're thinking of vairagya. You want the techniques that you apply in the practice, that whatever yoga knowledge you take in, to be directly corresponding to the practice. Okay? So it's very important that it has a practical play out. No matter how theoretical it gets, or kind of philosophical. It's very practical.